everyone. I hope this microphone is working. If it is not, I'm just going to be loud. So thank you for joining us on a Saturday morning. It's wonderful to have you here. And it is wonderful to be back at the Black Sea and the Balkan Security Forum with such distinguished guests talking about European security on a rainy day. I'm not going to repeat that it's Saturday again, but I just did. That said, I propose that we start. I am going to present our distinguished guests first, and then we are going to start the panel with brief introductory questions and answers. So I'll have the pleasures to actually ask the questions first. But then I'm going to invite you to raise your hand and ask your own questions and make your own comments. That said, I am joined together by Mr. Bruno TERTRAIS. I hope that I'm saying it correctly. I am sorry and I apologize if not. Who is the Deputy Director of the Foundation of the Fondation pour la Recherche Strategique, a leading French think tank on international security issues. He's a graduate in law and economics, and he's worked with NATO Parliamentary Assembly, worked with the Ministry of Defense, and also with RAND Corporation. And obviously, he is contributing with a lot of publications on the topic of international security and European security in particular, which you can see and check on the website of the Foundation. Also together with us today is Mr. Yordan BOZHILOV, who is director of the Sofia Security Forum. He's former Deputy Minister of Defense of the Republic of Bulgaria, our neighbor. He was a long-standing government official in the Bulgarian Ministry of Defense and Defense and Security Advisor to the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. And obviously, he's also a lecturer at the Sofia University. Last but not least, we also have Mr. Charles Powell, who is not the first time joining us, and thank you very much for joining us again and on such an important topic today in this panel. He's director of the Elcano Royal Institute of Spain, and that is obviously a leading think tank on international affairs. And who doesn't know him already, well, I think you should check the website of the Elcano Institute and see what he's been writing. He is an expert on European security as well, and overall, geopolitics, not international geopolitics. That was my fault. Geopolitics is by default international. So that said, I would like to start the discussions today with what concerns us currently, actually, which is Russian war in Ukraine and how that will transform the European security. And we are 6 months after the war has started, well, over 6 months after the war has started today, which is why I'm going to start by asking the question, the very broad question of how do you think that the war in Ukraine has affected the European security and the planning for securing ourselves in Europe for the years to come? Are we in a sort of a Cold War II, or are we not yet there? So with that, I'm going to open the floor to Mr. TERTRAIS first.
Yep, it's working very well. So I think it's very difficult to talk about an architecture while the house is burning. because that's literally what's happening right now. So what comes next depends on the outcome of the war, for which I have absolutely no doubt. But let me first say that the contours of the future European security architectures are being designed as we speak, because the lessons of the first 6 months of the war in this regard are threefold. I think one is a wider NATO, the second is a stronger EU, and the third, unfortunately, is also a weaker OSCE. When one talks about the security architecture, never forget that the OSCE was supposed to be created, built as a common European home, Euro-Atlantic home. Wider NATO, that's obvious. Stronger EU, yes, because the EU at the occasion of the war has proven that it was willing and able to be a constructive security actor by being the co-architect of the sanctions packages, working very well under the leadership of the Commission, working very well with the United States. The users of the peace facility was also a sign of the fact that the EU was able to adjust and adapt very quickly to a situation that it had not anticipated. The fact that Denmark, traditionally the opt-out country, has decided without much debate to join the European defense policy testifies to the fact that it does see the EU as a serious defense actor. And after the adoption of the strategic compass, the mention in the NATO strategic concept of the complementarity between the EU and NATO, I think should make it clear that the competition, if there ever was one, which I'm not sure, I don't think there has been one for more than 20 years, but if there was one, the competition is over. So I would say that regarding the architecture, it's a wider NATO, stronger EU, and unfortunately also probably a weaker OSCE. So what happens next depends a lot on the Russian future. I don't know if you want us to, should I make my full remarks now, or would you like just to have a lively debate? Yeah, I mean, the future of Russia is still very uncertain. Let me sketch out three possible futures for Russia after the war. One is a severely weakened Russia, with which some security debate, in particular on arms control, will still be possible, because Russia, in that scenario, would need arms control. Would need arms control because, having been militarily weakened, it would be in its interest to rejuvenate arms control. So, renegotiating with Russia, but Russia would then be in a position of weakness. The second possible future is the Russian fortress. The Russian fortress, which is, as we know, a topic which is hotly debated among European security and Russia experts, in which case we will go literally our own separate ways, as much, of course, as Russia will leave Europe alone. Can it? Will it? Does it want it? It's a much broader question, of course. But at least in this scenario, we basically build a big wall, symbolically speaking, and not only symbolically maybe, and Russia lives its own life for the next decades. So this has consequences for what we call the architecture. And the third possible future is a revanchist Russia, a Russia that does not accept the likely strategic defeat that it will suffer in Ukraine, and which seeks to meddle with European politics even more than it does today. So that's one key parameter, I think, when you asked us to think about the future architecture. That's obviously the critical parameter. Other questions to be raised after the war is, what security guarantees will we offer to non-NATO member states? And I'm thinking, of course, about Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, if it was interested in such guarantees, but I know that legally speaking and constitutionally speaking, it's complicated for Moldova. So these are, I think, other key questions for the future of security architecture. In the scenario, in the fortress Russia scenario, what will be the relation between Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia? Do we want Central Asia to be the theater of competition between Russia and China, or do we have a stake there? Do we treat the Caucasus differently? I would think yes, but that's another open question. Let me add just a few words on my country's stance on Russia, because the European security architecture is was a favorite expression of the French president for several years. I think, so let me give you my own 2 cents, or 20 lays, whatever, about how I think he thinks. I think he was honestly, sincerely persuaded that the post-Cold War settlement was unfair. He was persuaded by the argument that Russia was not humiliated, but at least close to being humiliated. I hasten to say that I think if that's what he thinks, he's wrong, but I think he was sincere in this belief. So the idea that we could do something which would accommodate, quote, Russia's legitimate security interest, unquote, is something that was and remained for a long time very, very deeply anchored in his mind. And in that, he does share the views of a non-trivial part of the French elite, but that's not necessarily the French consensus. The reason why he kept talking to Putin is a different question. I think he genuinely thought, and on this I agreed with him, that there should always be a channel of communication, if only to be able to gauge the state of mind of Putin. And I think he was right. By the way, I can personally testify that my belief, at least, is that he never talked to Putin without asking Zelensky first. After February 21st, he never talked to Putin before asking Zelensky, is it okay?
That's good news.
Yes. And from a pretty good source, the only time that Zelensky said it's not okay was after Bucha, after the discovery of Bucha. So anyway, this is just to say that I'm not here to defend Macron's policies. I criticize his policies a lot on some issues, but I'm more sympathetic on other parts. And finally, there's one argument that he's been using, and I think which is an interesting one, but I will leave it at that. 2 days ago, he made his big annual speech to the French ambassadors, and to defend his role in being a channel, not necessarily an intermediate, but a channel with Putin, a role, by the way, which he has pretty much abandoned. I mean, he no longer talks frequently to Putin. Last time was about Zaporizhia. It was very focused. It was about Zaporizhia. I cannot say whether or not this conversation had an important impact on Putin's decision to let the IAEA visit Zaporizhia, but at least it was a very focused discussion. So 2 days ago he said, would we Europeans be collectively happy with the fact that Turkey, our ally, but Turkey is the only country able to talk to both Washington and Moscow? So that was his argument. I mean, I don't know if it's a good or bad argument, but I thought this was an interesting way to legitimize his conversation with Putin. Anyway, so that's it for me at the moment. I think once again that it's a bit early to talk about architecture when the house is burning, but it's never too early to make plans for the future, because whatever happens next, we know it will be with a stronger Ukraine and a Ukraine that is closer to the rest of Europe, including Romania.
Thank you very much for a sort of an introductory. Okay, now it's working. So I would say that based on what you just raised, the important question, along with the question of what kind of Russia are we going to have, as we are thinking about what kind of Europe we are going to have in terms of defense and security, there is also the question of what kind of Ukraine are we going to have. And with that, before I go to what kind of Black Sea defense and security problems we are going to have, so before going into the neighborhood, I'd like to ask Mr. Powell for his view on the European security architecture as they are viewed from Spain, and not only, but also from Brussels, because I know you're quite active in Brussels as well with the think tank.
Thank you very much, Antonia. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to be back for this session as well. As Bruno was saying, and he has, as usual, stolen much of my thunder, it's very difficult to predict where we will be in, say, 6 months or a year's time. As we all know, the Ukrainians have recently launched an offensive to take back Kherson. One understands that the idea is that they want to take it back before winter sets in, and we could well see a situation in which the two sides will sort of settle down for a war of attrition to some extent, which of course is not a very palatable prospect either for the Ukrainians or for us in Europe, in the EU, and in NATO. Something Bruno didn't mention, of course, which is a factor, is what happens if the next president of the United States decides that supporting Ukraine to the same extent is not in the US's national interest. So sadly, I think the Ukrainians actually have a window of opportunity to defeat Russia, win the war, and of course it's very difficult to define exactly what that would mean, before 2024, before the next US president occupies the White House. So let's keep that in mind. There is a narrowing window of opportunity. So when we talk about a war of attrition, there is this caveat. You know, if the US no longer provides the enormous military assistance that it's currently providing, in 2 years' time, we could be facing a very different scenario. As far as this future European architecture is concerned, it's interesting, and we've very quickly forgotten the two documents that the Russians sent the US and NATO back in January, remember? Sort of draft treaties with the United States and with NATO. These documents are actually very revealing of Russia's mentality. We were very quick to dismiss them, and to be honest, I still haven't really worked out what precisely the Russians thought they would achieve. But it is very, I think, revealing of their mentality. So, obviously, Russia would require, well, first of all, there is no indication whatsoever that Russia is willing to negotiate. I attended the Bled Strategic Forum earlier this week in Slovenia, and the Turkish foreign minister told us, that wasn't Chatham House, so I think I can quote him, he told us that there are back channels between Ukraine and Russia. There have been constantly throughout the war. And the question he posed was whether we might be in a position to introduce confidence-building measures, if you like, that might lead these back channels to mature into something more substantial. Let me also say, by the way, that Turkey, Bruno has mentioned this, Turkey is playing a very interesting role. And notice, by the way, that the deal on grain exports has survived and is doing well, better than many people expected originally. So I'm not entirely despondent about some kind of agreement down the road, and I think Turkey would obviously be playing an important role in that. Obviously, any future agreement concerning the future European architecture, security architecture, would therefore first and foremost involve the United States. As I said, this is very clear from the January 2022 documents that the Russians sent. It would involve NATO, of course. I don't think it would involve the EU as such, as a player. It might involve Germany and France as individual member states. It would probably involve Britain as well. And as already mentioned, it probably wouldn't necessarily involve the OSCE, let alone the United Nations. The United Nations, by the way, we don't even talk about the United Nations, interestingly, these days, is probably one of the biggest institutional losers. As Bruno was saying, the fact that the strategic compass and the strategic concept were adopted more or less simultaneously points to, I think, a crucial element in this future European security architecture, and that is a much closer NATO-EU cooperation. So I think this may in fact turn out to be one of the few positive consequences of the war in terms of the EU's potential role as a global actor. And you asked us whether we're moving towards a new Cold War. I think the post-war scenario, of course, as I've said earlier, we don't really know how the war will end and what the terms of that peace will be. But remember, there are a couple of important things that will have to be cleared up. First of all, sanctions. The sanctions regime is very powerful, almost unprecedented. So how do you lift those sanctions? What kind of conditionality needs to be introduced? Secondly, the war crimes issue. We tend to forget this. You know, the war crimes issue is going to figure very, very prominently, and we cannot let the Russians get away with this, because the message we would send would be terrible. So, and of course the Ukrainians won't let us forget this either. And then thirdly, there's the whole question of reparations and reconstruction. People are asking, who's going to pay for Ukraine's reconstruction? Well, hopefully the Russians will, because we are sitting on a big pile of money. That is frozen Russian assets. Now we need to find legal ways in which we can access those Russian assets and use them to pay for Ukrainian reconstruction. Of course, all of these three issues, the sanctions, the war crimes, and the reparations reconstruction issue, are very, very complex and politically very, very delicate and difficult to deal with. So my prediction would be that we may well move, it's certainly not going to be business as usual with Russia. I think we may well move towards the sort of relations that we had with the Soviet Union at the height of détente under Kissinger, Nixon, and President Ford. In other words, we may eventually be able to work together again on some of the big issues like climate change, even perhaps, I think Bruno mentioned this, nuclear disarmament, and global health and food security issues, but the relationship will be very transactional. Additionally, I think it's important to stress it is not in the West's interest to push Russia into China's arms further than has already happened. And it's obviously not in Europe's interest to allow Russia to continue to meddle in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. So I think the West will eventually want to play down the current Cold War rhetoric, or the rhetoric which is reminiscent of the Cold War, not least because we don't want the global South to have to take sides all the time. And let me remind this audience, NATO countries only represent 12% of the world population, 12%. And we have seen in the UN Assembly how difficult it is for some global South countries to take decisions when it's a them versus us dynamic. So for all of these reasons, I think it'll be not unlike the Cold War, as I say, during the period of détente, but above all, a very transactional relationship. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for some optimistic view, I would say, especially on the idea that we might not want to continue the Cold War rhetoric, and as we wish for other countries not to take sides, as they've done so far. I have a question about that, but later on, after I will ask Mr. BOZHILOV to basically let us know how you see in the Black Sea the current status quo and the following architecture, especially since Turkey was mentioned a few times, and considering everything that is going on these days, very close to us, I would suggest. So.
Yep. Thank you very much first for inviting me to share some thoughts. It is, of course, important issues we are discussing now. But before I go to Black Sea and Black Sea security architecture, let me offer some thoughts on first how I see the future of general security architecture, because it is important also for the Black Sea region. And you also mentioned and asked about the relation between West and Russia after the end of the war. And I do agree with my fellow co-panelists that first, the conflict is far from over, so it's difficult to predict how this relation will look like after the end of the war. And because the war is not over, we can expect different scenarios in its development, which of course will affect further relations between the East and West. From military point of view, no country has sufficient military means to fully achieve its goals. So it's first point. The second point is that the war has negative consequences for the whole system of international peace and security. We have already seen problems of grain exports and negative impact on food security of many countries at a time when the main attention is concentrated in the region and, of course, on Russian aggression towards Ukraine. I see that many other factors can try to realize their priorities, let's say Iran, North Korea, or terrorist organization. All this, of course, will affect further relations between West and Russia. Very important factor is how this war will last, how long it will last. At this stage, we see no possibility for either party of having decisive success. And naturally, the quickest end would be if Russia withdraws its troops from the occupied territories. But obviously, at this time, we see no intention from Kremlin. And at the same time, we don't see public mechanism within Russia to make Russian leadership to change the course. I saw the latest research of Levada Center showing that 76% of Russian population still support Russian activities in Ukraine. Of course, this is a result of propaganda, of repressions, etc., etc., etc. Western sanctions, they do have an influence, but by themselves they cannot force Russian leadership to withdraw from Ukraine. So I see no mechanism at this stage that would lead the war to an end and a lasting solution. I think that the relationship between West and Russia will be determined by what system of international relations as such will be after the war. But again, the big unknown here is Russia. And I would like to offer you three possible scenarios about the future development of this international relations, of course, depending on what actor Russia will be. Of course, the best scenario, I would like to say, would be Russia to return and resume its international commitments and liberate occupied territories. At this stage, it seems impossible. Of course, this stage is the best one because it will be based on the core principles of European security and peace, which were created decades ago. The second possible scenario, if Russia tries to rearrange the existing security architecture according to its vision. Russia considers the current European security system to be NATO-centric. And you remember that in 2008, Russia already proposed Treaty of European Security. Charles mentioned that Russia proposed also treaty between United States of America and Russian Federation on security guarantees, agreement on measures to ensure security of Russian Federation and member states of NATO. So this Russian project fully and solely reflects Russia's vision on European security, or more precisely, of its own Russia's security. And of course, they were not accepted by the Western countries. That is why Russia tried to impose its vision through occupation of the whole Ukraine and to sit on the negotiating table as a winner. But it failed. Instead of fast and decisive victory, Russia engaged in a protracted conflict. Ukrainian forces are effectively countering Russian aggression, and Russia faces the unity of Western countries. NATO and EU are united more than ever. Russia will do everything possible to destroy this unity, not only to avoid sanctions and reduce pressure on itself, but also to continue with the implementation of its geostrategic agenda to restructure European security architecture. Russia is using all possible leverages like natural gas or Russian proxies in the individual countries, pro-Russian parties, NGOs, trade unions, to undermine confidence in NATO and EU, and of course to destroy the unity. In this scenario, Russia will continue to participate in the European security system, but not as a constructive, but as a destructive factor. An indication will be the upcoming UN Security Council discussion on the extension of the mandate of OTA operation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And frankly speaking, I expect that Russia will oppose this extension, which will have a negative effect on the Western Balkans. Third scenario, Russia turns to Asia in searching of political, trade, economic and financial partners, China in the first place. Such an option is not excluded since Russia considers the main elements of the current security systems as dominated by Western countries. Russia was already excluded by the Council of Europe. The General Assembly suspended Russia's participation in the United Nations Human Rights Council due to violations of human rights committed during the war in Ukraine. And I think that if at all, such an option is possible, but it is feasible in the long term. This is also puts many questions. What could happen on the regional and global organizations, United Nations included? When the crisis is over, will we see more general accepted rules and norms in international system? Or, on the contrary, the number of these rules and norms will start shrinking? Will the international system survive as such, or it will collapse? There are many questions about the future of international systems, also concerning economy, finance, international law, security and humanitarian issues, global challenges that it has been mentioned already. I think that the second and the third scenario portend difficulties in relations between West and Russia. And we can expect many other negative consequences for security resulting of these tense relations, like weapons control, it has been mentioned, nuclear non-proliferation, combative of international terrorism, tackling global issues, and from today's point of view, any development, unfortunately, are possible. And this brings me to the issue about Black Sea and about the role on EU and NATO in the Black Sea. I believe several issues are very important. And of course, first is to preserve the unity of NATO and EU in relations to Russia and its aggression against Ukraine. Second, it is important to strengthen the eastern flank in every respect, including militarily. But it is also important to build resilience and cut off any possibilities of Russian influence in the countries to the eastern flank through energy resources or using hybrid warfare or through activities of pro-Russian organizations. And what is also important, to be effective, NATO and EU shall develop their own Black Sea strategies with clear commitments, with committed resources. We have been discussing the issue of NATO Black Sea strategy for years. I think Black Sea as a region was mentioned in NATO summit communique back in 2000. In any case, after 2008, after the aggression in Georgia. But unfortunately, we are not able to present a comprehensive document. And mainly because three countries in the region, Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey, could not take the lead. And I appeal again, because now we live in a completely different security situation, we have to join our efforts. And first and foremost, three NATO Black Sea countries to try to propose and to take the lead in drafting and presenting NATO security concept on the Black Sea. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure this is working. Okay, so thank you very much for bringing it to the region. It seems to me that bringing it to the region goes back to the first question on, well, the closure of your introductory speech with what role for Turkey, considering that Turkey is the only player that seems to talk to both sides currently. And it seems to be on our minds the fact that everything having to do with strategy regarding Russia or regarding to the Black Sea proper has to do with a sort of an understanding of first what Turkey is doing and what we are doing together with Turkey. That said, I'd like to open the floor for questions, because this is your chance to ask our distinguished guests about their thoughts on what's going on now, the future of the European architecture, and what next. So, questions. I think, yeah. Just for the microphone to reach you fast. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Valentin Berca. I am from Craiova. I have a question for you, Mrs. COLIBЫNFANU. We are speaking about future architecture of Europe, but let's see the short-term new architecture of Europe. Everybody of us know that TERTRAIS initiative has three pillars: transport connectivity, energy connectivity, communication connectivity. So what do you think about Ukraine could become next year, because Romania will host this initiative forum. So Ukraine must become or could become member of TERTRAIS initiative, also of B9. Thank you.
Thank you. There is also the next. The microphone needs to go back to Mrs. Toderan.
Good morning. I was just trying to use the mic efficiently. Otherwise, I would have waited with my question. Good morning. My name is Olivia Toderan. I'm working with the Romanian MFA. And although my question doesn't have to relate directly to the title, I'm too selfish in my job not to take the opportunity of this panel, because Charles Powell raised a topic that is really of very much interest both to us in the world, but also to the minister and across the EU. What should we do, in fact, in our dialogue and in our cooperation now with the Global South, taking, you know, the various continents and areas which are not identical, in order to have them on our side, or maybe this is too pushy, but still not have them on the other side, while of course tactically having the dosage that would not force them beyond their limits to take sides. But it is a moment in history where it is very hard not to take sides, and it is in all our kind of the West interest to have the Global South with us. So of course, to just end, there have been already actions and coordinated actions, I would say, but because I deal with these countries, we keep constantly asking what would we do, what's the best to do in terms of both objectives and ways and means and tactics. And I'd like really your personal assessments of also Bruno, TERTRAIS, because I know France has a special, you know, spot or understanding of Africa, but also maybe of the Indo-Pacific, and Charles of Latin America. That's the background of your kind of strategic environment in which you're working. So I'd really like your personal assessments on what's best in this kind of global architecture, not European. Thank you so much.
Would you like to address the two first, and then we'll get another two questions? Mm-hmm. How's that? Okay. We'll get the next two questions after addressing the first, because I think there are broad questions already that we need to address.
Thank you very much. That's a very pertinent question. I was very interested to see that President Zelensky, who is obviously a very skillful politician, recently addressed the Chilean parliament. You know, he's addressed, I think, practically every parliament in Europe. But someone, I don't know who, but someone wisely advised him that it was a good idea to start to pay attention to the Global South, and in particular, Latin America. And of course, it's deeply ironic that some Latin American countries, African countries, should have abstained in the UN General Assembly, given that they traditionally, historically, have been so keen to defend the principle of territorial integrity, national sovereignty, and so on. I have just come back from a couple of weeks in Colombia, and I've spoken to senior officials there. So my advice to the EU and NATO officials would be, first of all, we need to explain what's happening better. We are very Eurocentric, extremely Eurocentric, and it's fascinating to watch the news in a country like Colombia, population 47 million, where the Ukrainian war, the war in Ukraine hardly features in news bulletins. So this is why I stress that NATO countries only make up 12% of the world population. So first of all, we need to explain why we feel so strongly about the war, why it is so totally unacceptable to allow Russia to get away literally with murder. The second advice is don't bully. If you talk to a lot of diplomats, African diplomats, for example, South African diplomats more specifically, and if you ask them why they've behaved the way they have, ultimately, in many cases, it wasn't that they disagreed with what we were trying to get them to do. They disagreed and strongly objected to the manner in which they were press-ganged into duty. Okay? We expected them to follow suit. We disrespected them very often. We underestimated the fact that they are national, sovereign, proud nations, and we simply expected them to go along with whatever we told them to do. And I think that is a very important part of it. And finally, thinking ahead, in an ideal world, and although I've been critical of the UN, in an ideal world, we do really need some kind of international conference at the end of all of this to try to perhaps have us reproduce a sort of post-1945 moment. In other words, to try to lay down some basic rules which might orient, which might guide international relations in the 21st century. Because notice we've just been talking about European security architecture, but what about the global security architecture? And it's not just the global south, it's other parts of the developed world as well. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I should start by saying how much I profoundly dislike the expression global south, which I find meaningless and slightly condescending, and I just don't like the way it's slowly seeping from post-colonial studies to mainstream discourse. That being said, for once, it's Charles stealing my own thunder. What I have to say on this is largely mirrors what Charles just said. I would say, first of all, indeed, understand the countries that we want. I mean, there are countries that we would love to see joining the sanctions efforts, but before asking them anything, let's ask them how they see this. What is their own perspective? Do they have any advice for us? You know, it's a question of attitude, and I largely agree with what Charles just said. Second, we need to build, and some of our countries are already doing so, to build a convincing explanation of why the Russian narrative is not only false, but a tissue of lies. Some countries don't want to listen to that. Some others are genuinely, you know, intrigued and seduced by the Russian narrative. So, I mean, this is a question that I think Fabien addressed in a different panel. So we have a case to make. We have a good case to make. Some countries don't want to listen, okay, but some do want to listen. Third, we have to put them in front of their own contradictions. When they claim to respect sovereignty, the rule of law, territorial integrity, etc., say, wait a minute, you can't put these principles in our face and then refuse to uphold them in a different context. So listening and be respectful does not mean not putting the finger on their own contradictions. By the way, let's be clear, there is sometimes a bit of schadenfreude. Yes. Oh, now you know what war is about. To which I understand, to which I would reply, well, okay, last time I checked, it has often been the West over the past 30 years caring more about this in Africa and Asia than the other way around. But that's not an argument that you can carry very far. So yes, point the finger on the contradiction that sometimes the countries and the diplomacies that these countries hold put publicly. And finally, if needed, use conditionality. There are countries which get away with a lot, and I'm thinking about India in particular, a friend, not an ally but a friend. India gets away with a lot. Look, at some point you can tell countries such as India, okay, it's your call, but if you do this, bear in mind that we won't be able to do that with you. It's your choice. It's your sovereign choice, and we respect that. But you can't have your cake and eat it. And some countries, this one, but that's just an example, are very good at trying to get away with that.
Your question about the Black Sea, and because I'm the moderator, I'm going to ask our guests to deal with that. But I will remember and will say a word about that too. So.
I think that we have to show to Ukraine that Ukraine is not left alone, and so we have to support Ukraine with any means, including inviting Ukraine to participate in different multinational initiatives. And 3C initiative seems to be a good opportunity because this initiative is designed to contribute to the development of participating countries. and to contribute to the connectivity between countries to the eastern flank, let's say. From this perspective, I do think that it will be only positive to invite Ukraine and see if Ukraine will show interest to participate. Because we do have already several very good projects which are well structured, financed, which will lead to the further development of the whole region. So I think that it might be a positive to invite Ukraine at least as an observer and see what will be the future interest.
Thank you.
I have a question too. What about OSCE relevance in the future of European security architectures? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Adrian Bratu. I'm the Romanian MFA. First of all, thanks to all the panelists for their very interesting insight. I will have a question mainly for Monsieur TERTRAIS. But of course, if the other panelists would feel like intervening, I would also be interested in their thoughts about this. Basically, two questions, I would say, about the European political community. And I realize I ask you to speculate a bit. It's not really fair, but I cannot keep myself from doing that. You said that we are in a flux, in what concerns the development and related to the security architecture in Europe. The European political community is one of the first formats to appear in this context. So my first question would be, do you see this European political community as part of the future security, architecture security in Europe? And a second part of this question, or second question would be, do you see this as possibly developing into something like an OSCE without the US? Let me explain a bit where I'm coming from with these questions. The initiative was presented in the beginning mainly related with the enlargement policy of the EU. But in promoting it, I seem to have seen ideas related to the remit of the OSCE in the sense of preoccupation for the security in general. And then the countries which are prospective members of this community are basically all the European states, if I'm not mistaken, apart Belarus and Russia. So if these two countries evolve into something more democratic, let's say, could they be part of this format? So basically, yes, I'm asking you to speculate, and apologize for that, but I think that these are interesting questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Quite often the French have good ideas and are really bad at selling them politically. This is another, I think, good French idea, but the timing was not good. The tactics were terrible. We gave the impression that it was an alternative to EU membership. And we, instead of quietly discussing this idea for weeks with our European counterparts, with your country, including your country, we just lay it on the table very late in the presidency, which I think was not the right way to put it, because the French are always being suspect of being reluctant to enlargement. So it has not, from my standpoint, it's a good idea because it brings together two things. Something which does not really exist in the OSCE, which is infrastructures, and connectivity. So it's different from the OSCE. And two, it brings together the possibility of having possible future members and past members. That is, having both the UK and Ukraine in a format that helps us design and develop joint projects and infrastructure connectivity. It's a framework that is rather unique and I think interesting because it's really a complement. On paper, it could really be a nice complement to what exists. So I see it as very different from the OSCE and as not being an alternative to enlargement, even though it could be some sort of a waiting room, and we have to be very clear vis-à-vis countries which seek to enter the EU, if it is one or not. But what I liked about it is the idea that you could also have former members, such as the UK. So that's my view. I'm glad the concept was not rejected, because I feared it was going to be rejected because the French were so bad at the way they presented it. And now let's flesh it out together as EU members. Let's see whether we can do something constructive with it, but potentially it is a constructive concept.
Yes, I'm very interested in the European political community, but I'm concerned now, and your question, I think, you put your finger on the problems that may arise. By the way, nobody mentions that in April, a month before President Macron proposed the European political community, my friend and colleague Enrico Letta proposed a European confederation, and he was actually much more specific about what this would entail. This European confederation would include the EU 27 plus 9 prospective members, so a total of a total of 36 members. The heads of government would meet after every European Council, so there would be a sense of political ownership, if you like. What is the problem that I detect? That we are beginning to confuse two things. One is how the EU can improve its relationship with candidate states, and let's be honest about this, we have let them down appallingly. During the pandemic, we turned our backs on Albania. The Albanians had to turn to Turkey. We turned our backs on Serbia. They had to turn to China and Russia in search of vaccines. So we very often don't put our money where our mouth is. So I think the main advantage of the EPC could be to allow some of these future candidate countries to converge more quickly, more effectively with the European mainstream. For example, by making, as I said, I think I mentioned this yesterday, some aspects of the four freedoms available to them before membership. If you think about it, it's extraordinary that we negotiate with countries for 20 years and we give them nothing while they are waiting, while they are going through these incredibly complex negotiations. So in the field of transport, infrastructure, investments, I think this might bring us together. What's the problem that I detect? If we bring in the UK, if we bring in Turkey, then we're talking about a different political animal. Liz Truss, I understand, is going to be invited to the first meeting on the 6th of October. It'll be interesting to see whether she accepts the invitation. I suspect she may well not, because she doesn't really believe in this. And Turkey, I think, is going to feel a little bit ambivalent about joining this. But my main caveats are twofold. First of all, candidate countries should never have the impression that we are trying to fob them off in order to prevent enlargement. And there is a very real danger that candidate countries will feel this way. And secondly, internally, within the EU, this should never be used as a pretext to prevent further deepening. There is no fundamental contradiction between widening and deepening. Deepening of the EU has always accompanied enlargement. So I think if those two caveats are respected, then this is a worthwhile exercise. Thank you.
We still have time for a round of questions there.
Mehmet Kınacı from NATO HCT. Thank you very much for this excellent presentations. I would like to take a little bit from the European level to the global level. The developments in the Pacific, in global south, you touched a little bit. What would be the impact on the European security for the future? We are talking about today. What about 15 years, 20 years ahead? What do you think these changes will bring to the European security architecture? Thank you.
Okay. Do we have another question, or shall we start with one there?
Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Vintrescu from Romanian Land Forces Headquarters. I have a question for Mr. TERTRAIS. You have mentioned 3 possible future scenarios for the incoming future. There is another one, very plausible one, which is not even the worst case scenario. And that means Russia being a winner party on a very long shot, because right now time is ally of Russia. Even Ukraine holding a Pyrrhic victory here. Russia still a fortress all the way, as you mentioned. Weakened Europe, not Russia, taking into account only the possible incoming energetic issue we might have in a very near future. So my questions are, do we haven't considered that? Take that scenario into account. How is that Russia, Ukraine, Black Sea, Europe is going to look like? And how is our approach as a whole, European Union, NATO? Because it looks to me that we do not take that into account.
If there is another question, I'd like to get it now. So, yes. Just because of time.
Yes, thank you. Liliana Philip is my name, and because we are talking about European future architecture, security architecture, and we touch a lot of new world order and global architecture. I want to ask, because no one asked that, what would be the role of the United States in this? And in the future of the European security architecture and the new world.
Okay, I think we're on a forecasting mood this morning. So who wants to start? Charles, and then...
We're going through a crystal ball moment. I can see this, and my crystal ball is a bit like the weather, cloudy. I just wanted to make one big quick point, which is, yes, the Ukraine war is a game changer. We have war in Europe for the first time in decades. But let's not remember some fundamental continuities. And this is my way of addressing your question about the US to some extent. Regardless of how the war ends, to some extent, we will continue to face 4 structural phenomena, if you like. The first is we will continue to live in an increasingly multipolar world, and those poles will be, if you like, more clearly defined than ever before. Secondly, we will continue to live in a world with very weak multilateral institutions, and this will be a fundamental challenge. Thirdly, this world will continue to be dominated by Chinese-American rivalry. I think Chinese-American rivalry, obviously, is the systemic feature of the 21st century. And fourthly, we will continue to face global structural challenges such as climate change, energy security issues, and the possibility of future pandemics. So let's keep this in mind when we talk about the Ukraine war. Again, let's not be overly Eurocentric. I understand that our minds and hearts are with the Ukrainian people and government, but there is a bigger world out there. As far as the US is concerned, obviously a great deal will depend on who the next president is, but almost regardless of who the next president is, what we are seeing and have been seeing for several decades now is a shift of US emphasis from the European theater to the Indo-Pacific theater. And this hasn't been mentioned today. The Ukraine war is an irritant for the United States. The United States did not want this war. This is something the Russians seem to have trouble understanding, by the way. the United States would be much happier if it can concentrate its efforts in the Indo-Pacific. And it is unable to do so because of the Ukraine war. So this reminds me to some extent of the consequences of 9/11. You know, George Bush, 43, had no intention of becoming bogged down in Afghanistan or in Iraq, and yet that's what defined his presidency. So the question, I think, for us in Europe is how are we going to respond to this fundamental shift in US priorities? And this, of course, brings up the whole question of strategic autonomy and, in general, of our ability to take defense and security issues seriously. Thank you.
Yeah, on the question of how will developments in Asia affect our security, I suspect that it will be mostly indirect. That is, it will be via the effect it has on US policy. Whether or not China gives signs that is willing and able to take back Taiwan by force in the next 10 years will obviously affect the US posture in Europe. And one of the problems, I know that it's a very French thing to say, the US is leaving, blah, 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 and so far it is not leaving. But it is true that we are not mentally ready for the idea of a quick change in the US posture. The US is a remarkably reactive country in that field. If things turn sour in East Asia, how will we react? We don't want to be like the children who are left alone without daddy suddenly doing an errand for work or whatever. I mean, we have to prepare ourselves for that. We are currently reassured by the re-engagement of the US administration, but we need to think ahead about what happens if there is, you know, a massive US operation to defend Taiwan tomorrow. And we're not yet ready for it. On the question of Russia, yeah, I think you're right. There is a scenario that I did not mention because I, like many people, don't want to think about it because I don't think it's likely. But still, a good forecasting is indeed taking also care of the non-probable scenario that you personally dislike. So let me give you that scenario. Scenario where China is increasingly aggressive, that a Trump-like president is elected in 2024, and populist forces gain ground in Europe, is a scenario where Russia could be a quasi-winner, whatever happens on the ground in the next 6 months militarily. So there is a fourth scenario. You're right. You're absolutely right. It's a complex one. It's one that we need to think about. Like what I just said about Taiwan, that's also a scenario we need to think about, even if we don't, precisely if we don't like it. I remain persuaded that the chances of Russian military fatigue are much higher than those of Ukrainian military fatigue. But still, there is a scenario where you have a combination of developments, domestic developments in Europe, domestic developments in the United States, and smart tactics by Russia, non-military, in a non-military field, where that scenario leads to Russia being a major player once again in Europe. So thank you for that. Thanks, but no thanks. But I must say that you're right.
Yeah, I think that decisive and full, we, you know, win in Ukraine from Russian side will be first and foremost a nightmare for regional countries, and of course this can open Pandora doors for many other potential conflicts all around the world. So that's why we have to put pressure on Russia to assist Ukraine not to allow this happening. This brings me to the issue about the role of United States. Actually, there are two main factors about the role of United States. Of course, it's first the political will within the United States to be engaged in security and defense of Europe, and the second, it's about Europe. And of course, in the current situation, Europe needs United States, mainly in the sphere of defense, of territorial defense, and vice versa, by the way. United States needs Europe. So I think that Europe will continue playing a substantial role. The United States will continue playing a substantial role in security of Europe.
I think it is interesting that we are concluding on a global note and on the role of the U.S. in the world. Just to bring it back to European security, I would but tell everyone what surprised me during the last few days when looking at the news. Germany just announced that it will increase its military presence in the Indo-Pacific. France is already a player there. So it is obvious that the Ukrainian war is not just the war in Ukraine, and it is obvious that as we are talking about the new architecture of European security, we are actually talking about the new architecture of global security. So that said, I wish you a very, let's say, pleasant Saturday intellectually and, thought-driven wise. And thank you very much for being with us today. This morning, actually. We have still the day. Thank you.